Hello and welcome to the Everything's Black Mike podcast with me, Aaron Stokes, as we bring you this special solo episode on Thursday, as we've got a little bit of breaking news to discuss, and that revolves around Alexander Isak. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like positive news for Newcastle United. We have heard this afternoon that reporting suggests Alexander Isak has told Newcastle United that he is ready to explore a move away from Tyneside this summer. It obviously comes after lots of speculation about Liverpool, lots of speculation about a move to Saudi Arabia, and it now looks like Alexander Isak's future is very much hanging in the balance at Newcastle United. He is not part of Newcastle United's squad that have currently jetted off to Asia for 3 pre-season games. And as I say, there's now huge question marks as to whether he's a Newcastle United player on September 1st when that transfer window closes. Lots to discuss this afternoon, and we'll get straight into it. Now, it's worth taking you back to this morning when Newcastle United were getting ready to jet off to Singapore for their first part of their leg in Asia. They obviously play a couple of games in Singapore and then they go out to South Korea. Big commercial trip for a football club. Obviously, thousands of fans are going to make the journey across. There's loads of Asian fans already there getting ready for the sort of festivities of it. And it was obviously a big blow this morning to hear that Alexander Isak was not going to be on that plane. Now, before we talk about Isak specifically, it's worth looking into the players who are on the plane and sort of discussing why there was a few alarm bells raised over Isak's absence. Now, the club, I must stress, came out and said that Isak wasn't on the plane because of a minor injury. We know that he's been suffering with a little bit of a thigh problem in recent days. And that was the club's official reason for him not being on the plane on Thursday morning. But then it's very, very interesting to see Lewis Hall is obviously on the plane. He hasn't played much football at all this summer. He's obviously closing in on a return after a foot injury. Joelinton, who was also left at home on Saturday along with Isak, he's on the plane. He's ready to go. And also the fact that this is a huge commercial trip for Newcastle United. They are going to want their biggest and brightest stars there to be meeting and greeting fans and shareholders and the rest of it. And Alexander Isak, obviously, the superstars don't come much bigger than him. So instantly, that was sort of flashing a few alarm bells, the fact that he hadn't travelled. A couple of hours later, the Daily Mail report that he has told Newcastle, he's informed the ownership that he plans to go, or at least plans to explore his options between now and the end of the summer. And that leaves Newcastle United in a hugely tricky situation. Because I must stress Newcastle's stance has not changed on the matter at all, whether it's Eddie Howe, the ownership, anybody around the club that you speak to. The message is simple. They do not want to sell Alexander Isak this summer. And you suspect unless a huge offer comes in or Alexander Isak goes to Eddie Howe and knocks on that door and says, look, Gaffer, I'm not going to play for you unless you give me the move that I want. You suspect Newcastle will stick to that stance. They're not going to let Alexander Isak go on the cheap, and they're not going to make it for any other clubs to get him, given how important he is to Eddie Howe and the team. As we sit here on Thursday afternoon, obviously this information is pretty fresh, but it does look like one of two scenarios are going to play out for Newcastle in the next couple of weeks. Scenario one is that Alexander Isak goes. Now, for that to happen, you are probably going to need a deal probably in excess of 130 million, maybe even up to 150 million to get that deal done before Newcastle even get to the negotiating table. If that does happen, Newcastle then have 4 to 5 weeks to not only replace Alexander Isak, which is going to be an almighty task on its own. You then have to think of the fact they still need a backup striker to Isak. They still need a central defender. They still arguably need a goalkeeper. They've been pursuing the likes of James Trafford for about 12 months. You could argue there's still 4 or 5 positions in that team that need strengthened, and that is before you lose somebody as crucial to this team as Alexander Isak. Now, look, a lot of people will be saying 150 million, let's just take it. If the player doesn't want to be here, you've got to just accept the offer and move on and spend it. But think of how tricky this summer has been already for Newcastle. They do not have a sporting director in place. They've got an outgoing CEO. They have missed out on a lot of transfer targets already. João Pedro, Liam Delap, Hugo Ekitike, to name just a few. This makes the summer incredibly harder for Newcastle than it already is if Alexander Isak goes. Despite the fact they might have 150 million sitting there ready to be spent, it is going to be a hugely tough task to not only replace him, but replace him adequately and also spend that money with, as I say, a month to go of the window. So that's option one. Option two is Alexander Isak stays. Now, that is either because Eddie Howe can talk him round and say, look, your journey at this football club is not finished. let's go into this Champions League season united and let's stay here. You're loved by the fans. You're loved by me. Why would your head be turned? Or because there isn't sufficient interest in Alexander Isak. Now, we've reported on Chronicle Live this morning that interest in Saudi Arabia and specifically Al Hilal, who are obviously majority owned by PIF, that is wide of the mark. We don't think a deal of that nature is going to materialise. The interesting one, of course, is the Liverpool interest. Now, I've just wrote a piece about this afternoon and about how Liverpool can, they believe, afford Alexander Isak. Now, this is despite the fact they've already spent 294 million on Florian Wirtz, 160 million. Milos Kerkez from Bournemouth, 40 million. Jeremy Frimpong from Leverkusen, 29 million. Mamardashvili, the goalkeeper who Newcastle wanted to sign last summer, he's cost nearly 30 million. And they've gone out and signed Hugo Ekitike this week in a deal that could get up to 79 million. Liverpool still believe they can afford Alexander Isak. They are still interested in Alexander Isak. And a lot of people will be saying, how can they do it? Because if Liverpool sign Alexander Isak, they will have broken the all-time spending record for a single transfer window, because it will take their spending well above 400 million. The record is currently held by Chelsea, 23-24 summer. They spent 391 million as they signed the likes of Cole Palmer, Axel Disasi, Nicholas Jackson, players like that. But Liverpool are in such a strong position financially, they believe they can do it. Now, that is because they generated £620 million in revenue in 2024, which was a 5% increase year on year. They've just signed a brand new £60 million deal with Adidas for their kit manufacturing. They pocketed 175 million for winning the Premier League, 85 million for their participation in the Champions League, and crucially, they still have players they want to sell this summer, namely Luis Diaz and namely Darwin Núñez, two attackers who are going to fetch you probably quite decent sums. You suspect Luis Diaz will probably go for 60, 70 million. They could probably try and recoup from that. Darwin Núñez abroad, you might get that. Instantly, those two players being sold have arguably paid for Alexander Isak. So Liverpool very much still in the race, and I personally wouldn't be surprised if they made a renewed effort. Now, that is when Newcastle stance comes into play. Do they say, look, we want 150 million? I suspect a deal of that nature, if Isak is adamant on going, probably gets done. For Newcastle United fans, some will think that's a great deal. Some will think, Newcastle United should be holding out for more than that, as crazy as it sounds. I put a tweet out a little bit earlier and it's garnered a little bit of reaction, and I just want to read to you guys because it seems like there's just a little case dose of sitting on the fence by some fans. People on either side of the argument. One fan saying, I think we should let him go now. I don't want him anymore. Somebody saying sell him, preferably outside of the English Premier League. Use this big PSR boost to build a better squad. One person has replied, I'm guessing that this is a Liverpool fan. Yep, they are saying you're never getting 150 million for him. Another one saying sell. Another one saying I can't see how we can deal with him this summer, and with there being next to no options in the market. Someone saying there's absolutely no keeping Isak after how he's behaved. Go and get the money for him and forget him. And somebody saying I would sell and I would go for Sesko and Wissa, Morgan Gibbs-White, and two centre backs. That would be quite a good hit the window. Now that brings me on to my next point, and that is really, if Alexander Isak goes, who comes in to replace him? Newcastle obviously have got 5 weeks left at the minute to replace him if they wanted to get a new signing in. Of the names, and there was probably a pool of 5 or 6 at the start of the summer where you thought, right, okay, these are the elite level strikers who could go this summer. Alexander Isak was one of them. Sporting Lisbon's Victor Gyökeres was one. He now looks like he's going to Arsenal. Hugo Ekitike was obviously one. He's now gone to Liverpool. Then you've got Benjamin Sesko. Now, that is a very, very interesting one. There's been reported in Germany this week that his price has been reduced to 70 million euros, 60 million pounds. And we know Newcastle United have had a big interest in him for quite a while. Now, I think, obviously, if Isak goes, Sesko is probably the obvious one you look at as a potential replacement. You think Leipzig will probably sell him. And I think fans will say 60 million, you should be snapping your hands off for somebody who probably could reach the ceiling of Isak. But aside from that, you probably are taking a gamble on some of the other players mentioned. There's obviously Samu, who's at Porto. He would be a very, very good option, but again, he's not going to come cheap. It does just feel like some of those options Newcastle probably could have gone for a couple of weeks earlier are no longer available. And by that, I mean, obviously, Gyökeres and João Pedro, obviously, at Chelsea, who we know Newcastle tried to get, and Hugo Ekitike, who, let's be honest, is not Alexander Isak level. But just 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of excitement that Newcastle could sign him because people thought, well, you know what, he could potentially be the heir to Alexander Isak, who could leave in a summer's time. That is obviously a conversation for a later day. At the minute, Alexander Isak is still a Newcastle player, and as I've mentioned, the club are steadfast in their belief they can keep him this summer. But certainly this development this afternoon of Isak potentially wanting to go certainly raises more questions now about what happens. Will that stance hold? Newcastle saying, look, we don't want to sell him. Or are they now going to be forced into it? And I think it's just worth bearing the point once again. Newcastle United have really, really struggled this summer for one reason or another. They still cannot financially match the clubs that they've lost out to, the likes of Manchester City and Chelsea. They can't break that wage structure, which is another reason why Isak is probably looking to go, because Newcastle can't offer him the wages that he wants. There's obviously speculation that he wants a deal worth 300 grand a week. Now, if Newcastle United value Alexander Isak at 150 million, he should really be getting 300 grand a week. But we know Newcastle at the minute with their current wage structure cannot offer that type of money for a player without the likes of Bruno and Sandro Tonali and Botman knocking on the door and saying, look, well, if Alexander Isak is way increasing his wages, then, you know, we want to sit and talk about revised terms too. Newcastle obviously still believe they can get Alexander Isak round the table, but they are not helped by the fact they don't have a sport director in place, despite reports in the last couple of days that Ross Wilson of Nottingham Forest is obviously the in pole position to take that job. Newcastle's summer has been really tricky. They've been trying to strengthen Eddie Howe's side. They've obviously done so with Anthony Elanga, but they still, as I mentioned, have 4 or 5 positions they want to strengthen in, and they're really struggling in that regard. Throw Alexander Isak leaving it in the mix, and it is a really, really tricky task for them this summer. So I personally think out of the 2 scenarios that I mentioned earlier, I think you try keep Isak and you try and get Eddie Howe to work his magic on him and say, look, I know you want to go, but just give us another year. Give us another year and we'll get back on the table and we'll see if it can meet your demands. I think that was a better scenario than losing Alexander Isak for 150 million and trying to replace him in a month in a summer window that has proved pretty bruising for you already. But as I mentioned by some of those tweets I read out earlier, I think opinion is very much split. And I think some Newcastle fans now will be washing their hands with Alexander Isak, which is so devastating because of how important he's been for this football club. But again, it might just be another reminder that Newcastle just aren't at that level yet financially, and in terms of the project, they just can't compete with some of these big Premier League teams, both on and off the pitch, even though they're on obviously the right direction of travel. Let us know in the comments if you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening on a podcast provider as to what you think, what you make of the Alexander Isak situation. Are you in the sell camp or are you in the keep camp? We will bring you more news on this as soon as we have it in the next couple of days, both on our website and on this YouTube channel. Plenty, you suspect, for myself and Andrew Musgrove to discuss on the Monday show when he returns. But until then, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll speak to you guys very, very soon.